right here. Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm just going to rephrase that intro and just welcome to the Hewlett Library's presentation of about Robert Frost. I'm Bill Thierfelder. I'm your host. Now, because we can't cover everything about Robert Frost in a 60 or so minute presentation, I invite you to go to my website for a deeper dive, and I'm going to demonstrate. So it's makingwings.net, and it's deeper dive number 75. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let me show you. So makingwings.net. You will be brought to my homepage, and if you go into the upper right corner, there's a little hamburger menu. There's all kinds of things that you can explore. You can even look at my resume if you want. But the main feature are these things called deeper dives. For every presentation that I give at a library, I create a page on my website so that you can explore the material deeper. And today's is number 75. So just go to where it says deeper dives, click on the chevron, and then you can click on Robert Frost.
We're not seeing your website.
Okay. Thank you, Judy. And now you are seeing my website. Are we seeing the website?
There we are.
Okay, thank you. Okay. So once again, if you go to the hamburger menu in the upper right corner, it's number 75. Oh, hello. And you would be brought to Robert Frost, and this is what you see. Okay, very good. And what you will find there, besides a couple pictures there, you'll see an overview of Frost's life. You will see, in addition, you will see recommended reading, which we'll talk about in a bit. You'll see print and video resources that you can look at, as well as things about his poetry collections and individual poems, some of which we'll actually be hearing today. So please avail yourself. Makingwings.net, deeper dive number 75. Now, once again, one of the things that you did see on that website page was a section of recommended readings, recommended media. Here are 3 volumes that I think are really excellent examinations of Frost's life. Many considered the 1999 biography by Jay Perini to be the definitive look at the poet. It is thorough, and it's very, very well written. Now, Jeffrey Meyer's 1996 biography is well written, but is proven to be a bit controversial among some scholars because it kind of perpetuates an image of Frost as, you know, this kind of cold-hearted megalomaniac. But still, there's a lot good in the biography. If you want something a little shorter, and I think excellent, it's Henry Hart's 2020, very recent examination. It's part of the Wiley-Blackwell Critical Biographies series. And it's a very fair-minded approach to a very complex human being. Now, any of these volumes will allow you to take a deeper dive into the life and work of this complex man who loved being the poet of the common man and woman. So with that said, what are we going to be doing in today's program? Well, we'll start with a timeline of key events in Frost's long life. We'll then look at Frost's 6 major collections and actually hear some of his poetry, and then there will be time at the end for your thoughts and ideas. So with that said, we begin. Robert Frost was born on the 26th of March in 1874 in San Francisco. Cute kid. And he was born to William Prescott Frost, who was a journalist from New Hampshire, and Isabel Moody, who was a school teacher from Scotland. Frost was named after Robert E. Lee, whom his father admired. Robert's sister, Jeannie, was born about 2 years later. Well, after some homeschooling, Frost entered public school in the second grade, excelling in geography and writing. But after only a year, he left school before entering the fourth grade. Organized education, he said later in his life, with a wink, was never to his taste. In 1885, when Frost was only 11, his father, William, died of tuberculosis. Frost absorbed from his father a great deal, including a feral drive to make something of himself, to exercise influence, to feel the world bending to his will. Indeed, Frost's lifelong passion to excel and win in whatever he did was also a legacy from his father. That's from the J. Perini biography. Well, also in that year, after Papa dies, Frost and his mother and sister moved to Lawrence, Massachusetts, where they had family. And indeed, the move was actually a return, for Frost's ancestors were originally New Englanders. And Frost would, of course, become famous for his poetry's engagement with New England locales, identities, and themes. Well, the year after moving to Massachusetts, his mother, Isabel, began teaching in Salem, Massachusetts, in a grade school where Robert and his sister Jeannie also attended. Well, despite his antipathy towards formal schooling, the 12-year-old Frost excelled in all his subjects. And Ralph Waldo Emerson became his favorite writer and would become a crucial influence on his thought. Well, by 1892, the 18-year-old Frost began a courtship with his future wife, Eleanor White, while they were in attendance at Lawrence High School. They often met after school in the Lawrence Public Library, where they would exchange verse written by their favorite poets. They later shared valedictory honors in their high school graduation. Well, in that same year, Frost had originally planned to go to Harvard, but began his undergraduate studies at Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire. Why? Because his grandparents, who were going to pay his tuition, refused to pay for him to attend Harvard because they felt it was, quote unquote, a drinking place. Well, while at Dartmouth, Frost devoted most of his time to studying poetry, hiking, and writing long conversational and confessional letters to Eleanor, who was attending St. Lawrence University in upstate New York. Well, eventually Frost withdrew from Dartmouth around Thanksgiving without even completing his first semester. He returned home, and as he said at various points in his life about formal schooling, I just wasn't suited for the place. Well, although he never graduated from college, Frost received over 40 honorary degrees in his lifetime, perhaps most ironically, 2 honorary degrees from his might-have-been alma mater, Dartmouth College. He also received degrees from Princeton and Oxford and Cambridge University. In 1893, the 19-year-old Frost took over his mother's elementary school class as a teacher, where he succeeded in winning the attention, if not the affection, of his pupils. However, Frost knew that the teaching of children was just not for him. So formal schooling wasn't for him, and neither was teaching, even though he was good at both. No, for him, the passion lay with poetry. In fact, he later told Eleanor in a letter that ultimately he intended to write poetry for a living. Now, the same year, 1893, Frost's paternal grandmother died suddenly in her sleep. She was perhaps the first person to appreciate her grandson's artistic leanings, as she called them. Indeed, Frost deeply appreciated her support and concern, and her death hit him very hard. In 1894, Frost also composed what he called his first real poem. He said that My Butterfly was written all in one go in the kitchen of his house. As he wrote My Butterfly, he had a profound sense that something was happening to him internally. He said that the process was, quote, like cutting along a nerve, unquote. My Butterfly was later accepted by the New York Independent, a national journal, making it the first Frost poem to be published. And he received $15 for his work, which would have had a value of nearly $400 today. So this was quite a sum. He was on his way. Well, 1 year later, in 1895, Frost finally wed Eleanor on December the 19th at his mother's church in Lawrence. In 1896, Frost's first child, Eliot, was born on September the 25th. And in 1897, Frost gives it another go. He enters Harvard as a special student and was financially supported by that once oppositional grandfather. Well, surprise, surprise. After less than 2 years, Frost withdrew from Harvard and returned to Lawrence when Eleanor's pregnancy took a turn for the worse. He received an honorable dismissal from the dean of the college. When he got to Lawrence, he immediately began to feel ill. A local doctor, recommended farming as a plausible occupation for someone with Frost's temperament. Now, this advice would stay with Frost for the rest of his life. Despite being born and raised as a city boy in San Francisco, the rural life was always more suited to his emotional stability. So the Frost family moved to a farm in Methuen, Massachusetts, where Frost's second child, a daughter named Leslie, was born on April the 28th. Now, she was later one of only two Frost children to outlive their father. And like her father, she became a writer. She lived until 1983, and she wrote a series of very successful children's books. Okay, let's do this. Come on. There we go. In July of 1900, Frost's 4-year-old son, that first child, Eliot, well, he died of typhoid fever at their farm. Frost blamed himself for not calling a good doctor sooner. It was, and he would later write, it was like murdering my own child, he said. Now, to compound that, his mother died of cancer in a sanatorium. Now, as always, both experiences were deeply profound for Frost, who was often overcome with bouts of depression and sadness. Both of those experiences eventually found their way into a poem that he wrote called Home Burial. If you have a chance to read that one, you can see how autobiographical they are. Well, the Frost family then, having fallen several months behind in rent, they were evicted from their farm in Methuen. It couldn't get any worse, right? Well, but silver lining. Robert, Eleanor, and the children were able to move to a farm in Derry, New Hampshire, which was offered to them by a friend of Eleanor's mother and was financed by Frost's grandfather. And you can see the farm on your screen. Thus began what is unquestionably the most important phase of Frost's long life, the period when he came into close contact for the first time with the material that would furnish him with a lifetime of imagery. The Frost family spent the next 11 years at the dairy farm. By the time he emerged at the end of this decade of farming, writing, and teaching, he would be fully formed, a major modern poet who had found his voice. Now, the first decade of the 20th century was devoted almost completely to his family. And though he wrote, he received little recognition here in America. In 1901, Frost's grandfather died suddenly, leaving Frost a large sum of money in the form of a trust and forgave all previous loans. What did that mean? Well, it meant that the 26-year-old Frost was now assured a certain minimum annual income. However, in his will, grandfather Frost wrote one stipulation. Robert was to have the farm without rent, but it would not become his farm until he had lived there 10 years. In 1902, Frost's third child and second son, Carol, was born. The fourth child and second daughter, Irma, was born in 1903. And like Leslie, she ended up being the only other Frost child to live past her father's death, passing away in 1967. We'll talk more about her in a while. In 1905, the fifth child, a daughter named Marjorie, and we'll talk about her. And in 1907, Frost's sixth and final child, fourth daughter, Eleanor, was born on the 18th of June, but very sadly died 3 days later. And this, of course, understandably sent Frost into another bout of depression. Frost was devoted to his surviving young family. You can see photos there on your screen. He played with the children, he educated them, he thought about their development. He was present on the scene daily. Okay? There was almost nothing else in his life during those Derry years. Well, after Frost tried out several teaching positions across New Hampshire, the Frost family moved lock, stock, and barrel to Beaconsfield, England. I have a little picture there on your screen. They moved there in August of 1912 so that Frost could study and compose poetry. He had enough money in hand from the sale of the Derry house. He had lived there for 10 years, just like he promised his grandfather, and then he sold it. He had enough money from the sale of that house and his grandfather's annuity to make such a move. The idea of living in the cradle of English lyric poetry was irresistible, and it was during this time that Frost worked on the manuscript of his first major book, A Boy's Will. Frost's first book, A Boy's Will, was published in England less than a year after he moved there. He was nearly 40 years old. That's quite a late bloomer in writing for a poet or a novelist. But as an American, Frost could not avoid certain misgivings about bringing out his work in England first. Indeed, he could not help feeling some resentment that his work had not been eagerly greeted in his own country, even though, to be honest, he had never made significant attempts to get published there. In any case, it was gratifying to find such enthusiasm for this work in the country that had produced Chaucer and Shakespeare, Milton, and Wordsworth. Frost finished the central poems of this next book, called North of Boston, which was published the following year in 1914. England's great gift to Robert Frost was recognition. England discovered him as he was discovering himself. Well, with two remarkable books of poetry under his belt, Frost and his family left England in February of 1915, and they come back to the States. At first, Frost was worried that he was leaving behind the only community that had ever been supportive of his claims to being a poet. Fortunately, his reputation had already begun to filter back to America. In June, the Frost family moved to a farm in Franconia, New Hampshire, which you can see on your screen. Frost found a little farm near the village of Sugar Hill and knew immediately that this was for him. He had not been writing poetry seriously for several months, ever since the return from England, but he quickly found his rhythm again, living in this farm setting. Well, Frost embarked on in 1916 on his first lecture tour, making stops at such places at Dartmouth, the New England Association of Teachers of English, the University of Pennsylvania, Amherst College, Harvard University, where he actually read as the Phi Beta Kappa poet. Just half a year back in the United States, Frost found himself a real contender for that small quantity of attention devoted by the reading public to new poetry. And I would also add at this point that Frost becomes, starting with this first lecture tour in 1916, becomes one of the first modern American poets to do poetry readings. Now, he starts out as a lecturer at colleges, but then he'll eventually broaden out to libraries and bookstores as time goes on, as we'll talk about a little later. But that sets up the ground for poets later in the 20th century, especially in the 50s and 60s, who really made not necessarily a living, but became famous through giving poetry readings. Well, in 1917, Frost's closest friend, the Edward Thomas, whom he had met while living in England, died in battle during World War I in France. In a letter to Thomas's wife, Frost wrote, "Edward was the only brother I ever had. I had 4 wonderful years with him. He is all yours, but you must let me cry my cry for him as if he were almost all mine too." And he later published a poem entitled To E.T. in the Yale Review. But 1917 also provided something beneficial. Frost was offered a teaching position at Amherst College. Now, this association with Amherst would become a more or less permanent aspect of his life until his death. Frost's initial Amherst years were a bit rocky, even though he was offered a full professorship, free reign over his classes, and an honorary degree, first of many. See, Frost didn't realize how out of the mainstream his approach to teaching was. He was highly eccentric, highly original as a teacher. He encouraged a kind of rebellion against the standard approaches to life. I often think of the Robin Williams character in Good Will Hunting, kind of a Frost-like character. Well, he ended up having 3 major teaching stints at Amherst, 1917 to 1920, 23 to 25, and then a long stint, 27 to 38. Well, Frost sold his house in Franconia in 1920 and moved the family to South Shaftesbury, Vermont. However, he also had to commit his younger sister, Jeannie, to a mental institution in Augusta, Maine. See that on your screen. Once again, mental illness would become a troubling preoccupation for Frost. In 1921, Frost began his affiliation with the Breadloaf School of English at Middlebury College in Vermont, a relationship that would happen uninterrupted for the next 42 summers, right until his death. Indeed, Frost's presence at the school became a huge part of its attraction to would-be writers. In 1924, Frost was awarded his first Pulitzer Prize for the collection New Hampshire. And we'll be hearing a poem from that collection a little later. Frost received a special fellowship at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor in 1925. It was created especially for him and would exist for the remainder of his life. Well, the fellowship entailed no obligations to teaching, and it provided for all of his living expenses. Now that's a gig. He would have his entire freedom to work and write. Well, needless to say, it was an offer he couldn't refuse, and this life of well-cultivated leisure was just right for creativity. And Frost's muse responded well. He had written a dozen or more poems as good as any that had yet been written in the United States. What remains interesting is Frost's consistent use of imagery taken from rural New England, even living in Ann Arbor. Even living there did not distract him from his regional preoccupation. But that relationship didn't last very long. Frankly, Frost was homesick. He returned to Amherst for the spring semester after being offered a $5,000 a year teaching position by the president of Amherst. Now that is ka-ching, ka-ching in 1927 money. Again, he maintained that relationship with the University of Michigan. He would visit from time to time, but New England was his home base. He was glad to rejoin his family in South Shaftesbury and to put the Midwest behind him. It was always Amherst that mattered to him. Wherever else he taught, it felt temporary. Amherst was always home. Well, in 1929, Frost's sister Jeannie died in Augusta, Maine, in that state mental hospital. It was an abiding tragedy for her brother, who saw traces of insanity in himself and his children that often led to fits of anxiety. After she was committed, Frost rarely saw her again, finding visits too painful to withstand. Frost's collected poems were published in 1930. The book would go on to win the poet's second Pulitzer Prize. He won 4 grand total in his lifetime, more than any other poet in the history of the prize. In the end, this capacious book solidified his reputation, appealing to a wide range of readers with varying degrees of critical sophistication. As a result of the Pulitzer and his work to date, the 56-year-old Frost was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Letters, another important milestone. But as always was the case for Frost, tragedy was never far away. In 1933, his daughter Marjorie, who was a 28-year-old archaeology student, married Willard Frazier, the future mayor of Billings, Montana. You see a postcard of that on your screen. They were together for nearly a year until shortly after the birth of their daughter in 1934, Marjorie died of a severe bacterial infection. Frost wrote, "The noblest of all of us is dead and has taken our hearts out of the world with her." In 1936, a further range was published and went on to receive the Pulitzer Prize in 1937, and that was Frost's third. Well, on the heels, though, of that success, you know what's going to happen, right? Another tragedy. Frost's wife Eleanor died on March the 20th of 1938 of heart failure at their winter getaway retreat in Gainesville, Florida, seen on your screen, ending their marriage of 43 years. Eleanor encouraged and loved him and served as a permanent muse until her death. With regard to Eleanor, most of his poems were written to her. All of his books thus far had been dedicated to her. Eleanor's death had, in a sense, changed everything. Well, the grief-stricken Frost began a rebound relationship with Kay Morrison, wife of his friend Ted, 4 months after Eleanor's death. Kay is in the center and Ted on the right of this photo you see on your screen. Now, eventually, Frost even went so far as to propose to Kay as part of, well, an impulsive behavior of a desperately lonely man. Kay of course, said no. But a very peculiar triangle was now in place, with Ted and Kay definitely married, but with Frost always on hand as a kind of, close uncle. Now, Ted absolutely knew what was happening between Frost and his wife, but he trusted Kay. He was also deeply respectful of Frost's genius, and he was willing to let a great deal pass unnoticed. It was almost a polyamorous relationship. Still, the relationship between Frost and Kay slipped rather quickly into the platonic realm, even after she went on to become his secretary. Ah, the things we do in grief. And grief. On the night of October the 9th of 1940, Frost's son, Carroll, committed suicide by shooting himself in the head with a deer rifle. He was only 38 years old and was found the next morning lying on the kitchen floor by his 16-year-old son, Prescott. Now, this event was staggering for Frost, as all the others had been. Depression and schizophrenia ran deeply through the Frost family tree, and for Frost, Carol's suicide was a grim reminder of the toll that mental illness often took, not only out in the world, but within his family. In 1941, Frost moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he lived until his death. You can see it's kind of two connected houses. I've given you the arrow here. This whole section was his home, and you could see the little placard there that signifies that. In 1942, a witness tree was published in April and dedicated to not Eleanor, but to Kay Morrison, the secretary. It won Frost his fourth and final Pulitzer. Now, that aforementioned toll of mental illness struck yet again. After seeing his daughter, Irma, abandon her husband and son, and watching her sink into the depths of schizophrenia. I mean, she would go out into the streets screaming, and it was really quite something. Frost had to have his daughter Irma committed, and she was committed to the New Hampshire State Mental Hospital, which you see on your screen. It was yet another of those tragic days for Frost, who now looked back over the fate of his children with a sense of despair. She would go on to outlive her father, passing away in 1967 in various states of mental instability. In 1954, the 80-year-old Frost attended a meeting of the International Congress of Writers and Intellectuals in Sao Paulo, Brazil. You could see a picture on your screen of what the town looked like in 1954. His daughter, Leslie, appealed to her father's sense of patriotism to go, right? Explaining that U.S. relationships with South America were at an all-time low, and maybe Frost's presence as a part of the U.S. delegation would send a strong positive message to the Brazilian people, and it did. According to several biographers, though Frost disliked Brazil on the whole, but he acted as if. He worked extremely hard, giving solid performances wherever he went. And you can see a picture of him there in Sao Paulo doing a book signing. In 1957, Frost was awarded his 27th and 28th honorary degrees from Oxford and Cambridge. The following year, Frost was awarded the post of poetry consultant at the Library of Congress, or what today is called the Poet Laureate. And in 1960, Frost was awarded the Congressional Gold Medal. Now, it was passed by Congress and signed by President Eisenhower in 1960, but it was bestowed in 1962 by President Kennedy. Well, at the age of 86 in 1961, Frost became the first inaugural poet at the January 20th inauguration of John F. Kennedy. First one. Now, we were talking about this before the program began today. with the exception of the inauguration of President Trump a few years back, pretty much every president since then has had some kind of poet, including most recently, wonderful poet Amanda Gorman for the Biden inauguration. Well, Kennedy's was the first, and there's Frost there at the podium, and you can see Vice President Johnson very helpfully holding down the page. It was a very windy day, but he was blinded by the harsh sunlight, and he was unable to read the poem that he had written for the occasion called Dedication. Instead, he recited his poem, The Gift Outright, from memory to much acclaim. The Gift Outright was one of his more popular poems at the time. Well, the following year, 1962, this is a very interesting little bit of biographical trivia, I think. Maybe not so trivial, but just kind of interesting sideline, right? The 87-year-old Frost accepted an invitation to meet Nikita Khrushchev, the head of the Soviet Union. The two discussed US-Russian relations, and there appeared to actually be some genuine mutual admiration. And to quote a letter from Frost to President Kennedy, "This is the way we are one world," as you put it, "of independent nations, interdependent, the separateness of the parts as important as the connection of the parts. Great times to be alive, aren't they?" Frost died at the age of 88 of a pulmonary embolism in January of 1963, and his ashes were interred at the family plot in Bennington, Vermont. And there you can see Frost and his wife and the 6 children. Well, whew, that was a bit of a whirlwind tour. For a more in-depth look, as I said before, you can visit my website, makingwings.net, and go to Deeper Dive 75. Now, before we go on, I'd like to give that last biographical word once again to Jay Perini. The contradictions of his life and work remain stunning. He was a loner who liked company, a poet of isolation who sought a mass audience, a rebel who sought to fit in. And although a family man to the core, he frequently felt alienated from his wife and troubled children. While preferring to stay at home, he traveled more than any other poet of his generation to give lectures and readings, even though he remained terrified of public speaking to the end. He was a Democrat who hated Roosevelt, a poet of labor who could not support the New Deal. He was an ardent Eisenhower supporter who enthusiastically campaigned for John Kennedy in 1960. He was a fierce anti-communist who embraced Nikita Khrushchev, personally calling him a great man. So very much a man of contradictions. And with that understanding, what I'd like to do is to look at some of the poetry. There were 26 volumes of poetry published in the poet's lifetime. Most of his best verse was written before 1930. But by that point, as Frost, at the beginning of the Depression era, Frost had become something that he always yearned to be, namely a national figure. Indeed, with his poem collections and poetry readings in his later life, he was to American literature what Grandma Moses and Norman Rockwell were to American art, an important elder who represented, at least metaphorically, American hopes and ideals, or perhaps better put, the hope for American hope and ideals. So what I'd like to do is to look at just 4 of his most well-known and beloved poems. His 14-line sonnet, Mowing, comes from his first volume, A Boy's Will, which was published in England in 1913. The language is simple, but Frost isn't afraid of playing with traditional syntax to create a beautiful flow of words and a lovely picture of a person alone in a field cutting down hay in the beautiful quietude of nature. It goes like this, and you can follow along if you'd like. There was never a sound beside the wood but one, and that was my long scythe whispering to the ground. What was it whispered? I knew not well myself. Perhaps it was something about the heat of the sun, something perhaps about the lack of sound, and that was why it whispered and did not speak. It was no dream of the gift of idle hours or easy gold at the hand of fay or elf. Anything more than the truth would have seemed too weak to the earnest love that laid the swale in rows, not without feeble pointed spikes of flowers, pale orchises, and scarred a bright green snake. The fact is the sweetest dream that labor knows. My long scythe whispered and left the hay to make. In his next book, North of Boston, published in 1914, Frost created one of his most famous poems called Mending Wall, in which a man questions the rigidity of his neighbor, a man who would rather keep to the status quo than see the world and himself in a new way. When he asks why they need a wall between them, he doesn't just mean the physical wall, he means the emotional walls we create as well. Oh, he could just pull down the wall and mischievously blame it on elves, but as much as he can't abide by his neighbor's stubbornness, he also respects his neighbor's decisions. He'd love it if the neighbor would change his mind, and he wonders if that's possible. So the title has many layers. On the one hand, it's about mending a wall that's fallen apart during the winter, but it's also about mending the feelings and attitudes that create psychological walls to begin with. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that sends the frozen groundswell under it and spills the upper boulders in the sun and makes gaps even two can pass abreast. The work of hunters is another thing. I have come after them and made repair where they have left not one stone on a stone, but they would have the rabbit out of hiding to please the yelping dogs. The gaps, I mean. No one has seen them made or heard them made. But at spring mending time, we find them there. I let my neighbor beyond the hill know, and on a day we meet to walk the line and set the wall between us once again. We keep the wall between us as we go. To each the boulders have fallen to each, and some are lows and some so nearly balls, we have to use a spell to make them balance. Stay where you are until our backs are turned. We wear our fingers rough with handling them. Oh, just another kind of outdoor game, one on a side. It comes to little more. There, where it is, we do not need a wall. He is all pine, and I am apple orchard. My apples will never get across and eat the cones under his pines, I tell him. He only says, good fences make good neighbors. Spring is the mischief in me, and I wonder if I could put a notion in his head. Why do they make good neighbors? Isn't it where there are cows? But here there are no cows. Before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offense. Oh, something there is that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down. Oh, I could say elves to him, but it's not elves exactly, and I'd rather he said it for himself. I see him there, bringing a stone grasped firmly by the top in each hand, like an old Stone Age savage armed. He moves in darkness, as it seems to me, not of woods only and the shades of trees. He will not go behind his father's saying, and he likes having thought of it so well that he says again, Good fences make good neighbors. In 1924, a Pulitzer Prize was awarded to Frost's collection, New Hampshire. Now, it contains this wonderful, familiar gem that captures the silence of a snowy evening, the solitude of a narrator whose spiritual fuel is in nature, the realization that life must go on with all its sundry obligations before he can sleep, both literally and at some point in his future, metaphorically. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though, and he will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near between the woods and frozen lake the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there's some mistake. The only other the sound is the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep. And miles to go before I sleep. In 1930, Frost won another Pulitzer for his collected poems, which contained verse from his first 5 volumes, A Boy's Will, North of Boston, Mountain Interval, New Hampshire, and then one that we haven't looked at called West Running Brook. Well, one of the most famous of the poems in that collected poems is The Road Not Taken. And it tells the familiar story of a person who's confronted with a choice. Which road in life do I take? I weigh the options, but realize I must make a choice. And when I do, I realize that my choice can and will make all the difference in the world. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. And then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though as for that, the passing there had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay, and leaves no step had trodden back. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh somewhere, ages and ages hence. 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by. And that has made all the difference. Well, there's so much more, of course, but I hope these 4 familiar gems have been a Whitman sampler, no pun on that poet's name, to whet your appetite to read a little bit more. And when you do, it's always intriguing to wonder how many of his narrators are autobiographically inspired, or a fictitious creation representing what he'd like or wish to be. Once again, remember that you can find out more about Frost at makingwings.net, deeper dive 75. So now it's time for your thoughts and ideas, and we can open this up.
Folks, please feel free to unmute yourselves, and if you have any questions, you can ask them.
Great presentation, Bill.
Thank you very much, Judy.
You know, it never occurred to me how many of the lines from his poems have become part of daily conversation.
Yes,
Like good fences make good neighbors, like the road less traveled, like miles to go before I sleep. I mean, we say these things all the time, and it never occurred to me that they're all from his poetry.
right. And, you know, that is in great part, I mean,